Candia 1347, the jewel of Venetian Crete, a vital port city teeming with commerce. Ships from Venice, Genoa, and the Levant crowded its harbor, their holds laden with silks, spices, and the promise of prosperity. Yet beneath the veneer of wealth, a silent terror crept closer with each passing day. The first whispers came from the east, carried by sailors returning from plague-ridden ports. Soon, the whispers turned into screams as the Black Death descended upon Candia with merciless fury. Swollen buboes, black splotches, and agonizing fevers marked its victims, claiming lives indiscriminately. Marco Zeno, a prominent Venetian merchant, watched with growing alarm as the plague decimated Candia's population. His warehouses stood idle, ships remained in port, and trade ground to a halt. The disruption threatened to bankrupt his family and undermine Venice's control over the lucrative Cretan trade routes. Rumors spread like wildfire through the city's taverns and marketplaces. Some whispered of divine retribution for the sins of Venice. Others spoke of a dark conspiracy by foreign powers to weaken the Republic. Fear and paranoia gripped the hearts of both Venetians and Cretans alike. Amidst the chaos, whispers of Byzantine conspiracies started to spread through the local population. Many believed the disease was a curse brought on by the Latins, and that only a return to the Orthodox faith could save them. In the village of Anogia, nestled in the mountains outside Candia, Sophia Melicinos listened with growing dread to tales of the plague ravaging the city. Her family, like many Cretans, depended on trade with Candia for their livelihood, and the closure of the city gates threatened their very survival. As the plague tightened its grip on Candia, the flow of goods and information to the surrounding villages dwindled to a trickle. Fear and suspicion festered, breeding resentment towards the Venetian authorities who seemed powerless to stop the devastation. Marco, determined to safeguard Venice's interests, implemented strict quarantine measures, sealing off infected neighborhoods and dispatching armed guards to enforce order. His actions, while necessary, only deepened the resentment felt by the Cretan population, who saw them as further proof of Venetian oppression. Far from Venice, in Constantinople, Alexios Doukas, a Byzantine official with a keen interest in Crete, followed the unfolding events with growing anticipation. He saw the plague as an opportunity to exploit the island's instability and weaken Venice's grip on the territory. In the shadows of Candia, whispers of rebellion began to circulate. Secret meetings were held in darkened alleyways, where Cretan patriots plotted to overthrow their Venetian overlords and reclaim their island's independence. Back in Anogia, Sophia witnessed firsthand the suffering of her people. The plague had not yet reached their village, but the fear and uncertainty were just as devastating. She knew that something had to be done to protect her community and to challenge the injustice of Venetian rule. As the sun set over Candia, casting long shadows across the plague-ridden city, the stage was set for a conflict that would determine the future of Crete. A struggle for power, resources, and ultimately, the soul of an island caught between empires. Alexios Doukas arrived in Candia under the guise of a trade envoy, but his heart held a different purpose. He was here to observe, to listen, and to assess the possibility of restoring Crete to the embrace of Byzantium. The Venetian flag flew defiantly over the harbor, a constant reminder of the island's subjugation. Marco Zeno watched the arrival of the Byzantine ship with a merchant's skepticism and a politician's wariness. Every new arrival in Candia was a potential disruption, a possible threat to Venice's carefully cultivated dominance. Outside the city walls, Sophia Melicinos witnessed the devastation wrought by the plague. The vineyards, once a symbol of Cretan prosperity, now lay neglected, overshadowed by the ever-present specter of death. She saw the suffering of her people and felt the weight of their discontent. Alexios moved subtly, meeting with Cretan leaders under the cloak of darkness. He spoke of shared heritage, of the Byzantine Empire's past glory, and of the possibility of a future free from Venetian oppression. He planted seeds of hope and discord. Reports of secret meetings and whispered conspiracies reached Marco's ears. He knew that the plague had weakened Venice's grip on Crete, creating an opportunity for those who sought to undermine their authority. He vowed to crush any sign of rebellion swiftly and decisively. Sophia found herself drawn to the growing whispers of resistance. The priest's words resonated with her deep-seated resentment towards the Venetian overlords and her desire for a better future for her people. Under the cover of darkness, Alexios penned his reports to Constantinople. He detailed the Venetian weaknesses, the Cretan grievances, and the potential for a successful Byzantine intervention. He emphasized the strategic importance of Crete and the opportunity to reclaim it for the empire. The message, entrusted to a swift galley, raced across the Aegean Sea, carrying Alexios's assessment to the emperor in Constantinople. The fate of Crete hung in the balance, dependent on the decisions made in the distant capital. Marco's methods were brutal. He employed spies and informants, and those suspected of disloyalty were subjected to harsh interrogation. He believed that fear was the most effective weapon against rebellion. Sophia, now fully committed to the cause, used her knowledge of herbs and healing to tend to the wounded rebels, providing them with comfort and support in their struggle against Venetian oppression. Alexios, aware of Sophia's growing influence among the rebels, met with her in secret. He offered her words of encouragement and hinted at the possibility of Byzantine support, further fueling the flames of rebellion. Candia, once a symbol of Venetian power and prosperity, stood on the brink of chaos. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the winds of change were gathering. The Byzantine shadows lengthened, threatening to engulf the island in a new era of conflict. Marco Zeno addressed the throng, his voice amplified to reach the farthest corners of the marketplace. He spoke of Venetian resolve, of the necessity for strict quarantine, and the dire consequences for those who defied the imposed order. His words, though laced with promises of assistance, carried an undercurrent of threat, a reminder of Venice's iron grip. From the periphery of the agitated crowd, Alexios Doukas watched Marco Zeno's display of power. He noted the fear and resentment etched on the faces of the Cretans, a fertile ground for sowing seeds of discontent. The heavy-handed Venetian response only served to deepen the existing rifts. Sophia Melicinos listened to Marco Zeno's speech with growing unease. The Venetian's words rang hollow, offering little comfort to those who had lost loved ones or whose livelihoods were threatened. She felt the simmering anger of her people, a sense of injustice that threatened to boil over. Under Marco Zeno's strict orders, suspected plague carriers were forcibly confined to their homes, marked as a danger to the community. The act, intended to contain the spread of the disease, instilled terror and fueled the growing belief that the Venetians cared little for the lives of the Cretans. Sophia, defying the Venetian decree, risked her own safety to provide aid to those imprisoned by the quarantine. She understood the necessity of preventing the plague's spread, but she could not stand idly by while her neighbors starved within their homes. Venice, fearful of famine amidst the plague, tightened its control over the island's grain supply. Warehouses overflowed with provisions, but distribution was tightly regulated, favoring Venetian interests and fueling accusations of hoarding and price gouging from the Cretans. Alexios, operating under the cloak of diplomatic immunity, met with disgruntled Cretan leaders, subtly stoking their resentment towards Venetian rule. He spoke of Byzantine heritage, of shared Orthodox faith, and of the opportunity to reclaim their island from foreign oppressors. The whispers of rebellion began to spread throughout the Cretan countryside. Frustration over Venetian policies, coupled with the devastation of the plague, had ignited a spark of resistance. However, disagreements arose on the best course of action, dividing communities and threatening to undermine any organized effort. Marco Zeno, aware of the rising discontent, employed ruthless tactics to suppress any signs of rebellion. Suspected agitators were arrested, interrogated, and often subjected to brutal punishments as a warning to others. Witnessing the brutality of Venetian rule firsthand, Sophia's commitment to resistance deepened. She became a symbol of hope for the oppressed, offering aid and comfort to those who had suffered under Venetian policies. Alexios carefully drafted a message to Constantinople, outlining the volatile situation in Crete and requesting further support for the burgeoning rebellion. He believed that the time was ripe for the Byzantine Empire to reclaim its lost territory. As darkness fell upon Candia, the atmosphere grew thick with tension. Small acts of defiance escalated into open rebellion, the flames of discontent visible on the horizon. Marco Zeno, standing watch over the city, knew that the Venetian grip on Crete was slipping, threatened by both internal dissent and external machinations. The air hung thick with the stench of death in Sophia's village. Each sunrise brought fresh sorrow, each cart a grim reminder of Venice's inability to protect its own subjects. The plague gnawed at the Cretan population, but Venetian indifference festered just as deeply. Sophia, like many others, used her knowledge of local herbs and remedies to care for the afflicted. The Venetian physicians were few and far between, often unavailable or unwilling to venture into the remote villages. Venetian tax collectors, enforcing Marco Zeno's decrees, arrived in the village. Their presence was a stark contrast to the despair of the villagers, their demands for grain and coin adding insult to the injury of the plague. Resentment simmered beneath the surface. Sophia witnessed the injustice with growing fury. The Venetian authorities seemed more concerned with extracting wealth than providing aid, deepening the divide between colonizer and colonized. Whispers of rebellion began to circulate. Secret meetings were held under the cloak of night, where grievances were aired and plans were hatched. Talk of Byzantine support fueled the flames of discontent. Sophia listened to the elders recount tales of Cretan resistance against Venetian rule, stories of heroes and martyrs who had fought for their freedom. A sense of duty stirred within her, a call to protect her people from further oppression. Under the guise of a traveling scholar, Alexios Doukas made contact with the village elders. He spoke of Byzantine support, of weapons and supplies that could be provided to aid their struggle against Venetian tyranny. He painted a vision of a Crete freed from foreign rule, a Crete restored to its rightful place within the Byzantine fold. Alexios carefully laid out his plan, emphasizing the need for secrecy and coordination. He promised that Byzantine ships would arrive with arms and reinforcements, but only if the Cretans could prove their resolve. Sophia, drawn by the hushed voices, secretly observed the meeting. The promise of Byzantine aid ignited a spark of hope within her. She knew that joining the rebellion would be a dangerous path, but the alternative, continued oppression under Venetian rule, was unbearable. Back in Candia, Marco Zeno received disturbing reports of growing unrest. He dismissed them as the grumbling of a plague-ridden populace, but a nagging doubt persisted. He knew that Byzantine agents were active on the island, and he suspected they were fanning the flames of rebellion. To maintain order, Marco dispatched more soldiers to patrol the villages. Their presence intended to intimidate the Cretans and discourage any thoughts of rebellion. But their heavy-handed tactics only served to further alienate the population. Sophia made her decision. The time for whispers was over. She would join the rebellion and fight for the freedom of her people. The dagger hidden beneath her cloak was a symbol of her commitment, a promise of resistance against Venetian tyranny. The weight of the dead pressed down on Candia. Each day, the number of bodies far exceeded the capacity for proper burial. Mass graves, hastily dug outside the city walls, became the final resting place for countless souls, a testament to the plague's unrelenting grip. Lawlessness festered in the plague's wake. With the Venetian guard decimated by illness, bands of desperate men roamed the streets, preying on the vulnerable. Marco, struggling to maintain order, found his authority eroding with each passing day. In the villages, where death was an unwelcome guest, communal bonds strained but did not break. Sophia and other women worked tirelessly, offering what little comfort they could to the sick and dying, their faith a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. Under the guise of offering assistance, Alexios subtly fanned the flames of discontent. He reminded the Cretan elders of their Byzantine heritage, of the heavy yoke of Venetian rule, and hinted at the possibility of a different future. Marco faced rebellion not only from the Cretans, but also from his own ranks. Fear and desperation drove the Venetian soldiers to the brink of mutiny, demanding more rations and fewer patrols in the disease-ridden streets. Sophia, tending to the needs of her village, becomes aware of a growing undercurrent of resistance. Whispers of rebellion circulate in the shadows, fueled by Venetian neglect and the promise of Byzantine support. Alexios carefully orchestrates the rebellion, sending coded messages to Constantinople, requesting more resources and assurances of support for the Cretan uprising. His ambition burned brighter than ever. Marco, despite his efforts, feels the control slipping from his grasp. The city walls, once symbols of Venetian power, now seemed like a fragile barrier against the storm gathering outside. Sophia, witnessing the despair of her people, makes a decision. She joins the ranks of the rebels, using her knowledge of the land and her unwavering spirit to aid their cause. As the plague began to ebb, Alexios saw his opportunity. The chaos he had sown was bearing fruit. The Cretan rebellion had begun. The rebellion erupted with fury. Villages surrounding Candia rose up in arms, their anger fueled by years of oppression and the recent devastation of the plague. Marco prepared for the inevitable siege, knowing that Venice's grip on Crete was hanging by a thread. With the first light of dawn, Sophia led her fellow rebels towards Candia, a wave of defiance against the Venetian stronghold. The future of Crete hung in the balance, poised on the edge of a bloody conflict. Alexios gathered the Cretan leaders under the veil of secrecy. Promises of Byzantine gold and soldiers fueled their growing discontent. He painted a vivid picture of a Crete freed from Venetian chains, restored to its rightful place within the Byzantine fold. Sophia, ever vigilant, ensured the safe passage of supplies and messages. She navigated the treacherous terrain, her heart heavy with the burden of her people's suffering, but resolute in her commitment to their liberation. Marco, ever suspicious, pieced together fragments of intercepted messages. Byzantine seals and coded language pointed towards a deliberate campaign to undermine Venetian authority. He felt the tightening grip of a well-orchestrated conspiracy. Alexios dispensed Byzantine aid with calculated generosity. Each coin was a seed of rebellion, sown in the fertile ground of Cretan discontent. He exploited the Venetian neglect and the people's desperation to his advantage. Marco tightened the Venetian grip. He ordered increased surveillance, fortified key positions, and implemented stricter curfews. He would not allow Byzantine treachery to jeopardize Venice's hold on Crete. Sophia's role grew more perilous. She became a vital link in the clandestine network, smuggling messages and supplies between villages, her every action a dangerous act of defiance against Venetian rule. Alexios orchestrated the rebellion from the shadows. He ensured that the Cretan rebels received the training and resources they needed to challenge Venetian authority, carefully calibrating the level of support to maintain plausible deniability. Marco's patience wore thin. He employed increasingly brutal methods to suppress the growing dissent. The dungeons of Candia echoed with the screams of those who dared to defy Venetian rule. Sophia's compassion was a beacon of hope amidst the rising tide of violence. She risked her life to care for the wounded, providing them with comfort and tending to their wounds, strengthening their resolve to fight on. Alexios meticulously documented his actions, crafting a narrative that would justify his actions to the Byzantine emperor and secure his place in history. He believed he was acting in the best interests of the empire, reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. Marco rallied his forces, preparing for a decisive confrontation. He declared martial law, promising swift and merciless punishment to any who dared to challenge Venetian authority. He was determined to crush the rebellion and secure Venice's dominion over Crete. The first flames of rebellion flickered across the Cretan landscape. Sophia watched, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, as the long-simmering resentment finally erupted into open defiance. The fate of Crete hung in the balance. The prearranged signals flared to life across the Cretan landscape. Beacons on mountaintops relayed the message. The rebellion had begun. Villages outside Candia rose up in coordinated strikes, targeting Venetian outposts and supply lines. Alexios watched from afar, his plan unfolding. News of the uprising reached Marco in a flurry of panicked reports. Venetian garrisons were being overrun, warehouses plundered and roads blockaded. He barked orders, rallying the city guard and dispatching messengers to hire mercenaries from the ships docked in the harbor. The defense of Candia was paramount. Sophia worked tirelessly alongside other women, tending to the wounded brought in from the skirmishes. The rebellion was a mix of organized fighters and desperate villagers, united by their hatred of Venetian rule. She offered them what solace she could, knowing the odds were stacked against them. The siege of Candia tightened. Cretan rebels, armed with makeshift weapons and fueled by rage, surrounded the city. Volleys of arrows and stones rained down on the Venetian defenders, who returned fire with crossbows and siege weaponry. The city was under siege. Marco, desperate to bolster the city's defenses, addressed a band of mercenaries. He offered them generous payment in gold, promising riches and plunder in exchange for their loyalty. The mercenaries, a motley crew of hardened warriors, readily agreed. Under the cloak of darkness, Alexios continued to coordinate the rebellion. He met with Cretan leaders, providing them with maps of Venetian fortifications and offering strategic guidance. Byzantine support, though subtle, was crucial to the rebels' efforts. Sophia became a vital link between the scattered rebel factions. She carried messages, delivered supplies, and gathered intelligence, risking her life to support the cause. The siege had turned the countryside into a war zone. The Venetians retaliated with brutal force. Catapults hurled massive stones at the rebel positions, crushing homes and scattering the insurgents. The siege turned into a war of attrition, with both sides suffering immense losses. Inside the city walls, food supplies dwindled. Marco oversaw the rationing of grain and other provisions, knowing that hunger could break the morale of the defenders as easily as the rebels' attacks. Under the cover of darkness, the rebels launched a desperate assault on the city walls. Ladders were raised, and wave after wave of fighters attempted to breach the defenses. The Venetians met them with boiling oil, stones, and a hail of arrows. Alexios observed the carnage from a distant hilltop, his face unreadable. He knew that the siege would be a long and bloody affair, but he was confident that Venetian resolve would eventually crumble. The future of Crete hung in the balance. Sophia gazed towards Candia, her heart heavy with the suffering she had witnessed. The siege had brought out the best and worst in people. She knew that the fight for Crete was far from over, and she steeled herself for the challenges ahead. The rebellion, though ignited, sputtered with internal discord. Whispers of Venetian gold had poisoned the minds of some Cretan leaders, sowing seeds of doubt and mistrust. Alexios knew that if this rot wasn't excised, the entire endeavor would collapse. Sophia, ever vigilant, had noticed the furtive glances and secretive meetings among some of the rebel commanders. Her heart pounded with a dreadful premonition. Something was amiss, something that threatened to shatter their fragile unity. Marco Zeno, ever the pragmatist, had been busy. His agents, woven into the fabric of Cretan society, had identified those whose loyalty was easily purchased. The price: Venetian gold and promises of amnesty. The goal: to cripple the rebellion from within. Sophia, after days of relentless investigation, uncovered damning evidence. A coded message detailing plans to betray the rebellion's supply lines to the Venetians. She knew she had to act swiftly, even if it meant confronting those she had once trusted. Sophia presented her findings to Alexios. The Byzantine governor listened with growing fury. The betrayal struck at the heart of his strategy, threatening to undermine everything he had worked for. A decision had to be made. How far was he willing to go to save the rebellion? Justice, swift and brutal, was meted out. The betrayers were exposed, their treachery laid bare before their comrades. A wave of anger and resentment swept through the rebel ranks, solidifying their resolve, but also deepening the existing divisions. News of the failed plot reached Marco Zeno. His carefully laid plans had crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The rebellion, instead of collapsing, had grown stronger, fueled by righteous anger and a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he had to act quickly to regain the upper hand. Alexios, emboldened by the quashing of the Venetian plot and the renewed fervor of the rebels, addressed the Cretan leaders. He declared that Byzantium would openly support their cause, promising soldiers, supplies, and ships to break the Venetian yoke. The time for subtle maneuvering was over. The time for open war had arrived. While the men prepared for battle, Sophia worked tirelessly to heal the wounded and comfort the dying. The cost of freedom was being paid in blood and tears, and she bore witness to it all, her resolve hardening with each passing day. Under the cover of darkness and a brewing storm, Byzantine galleys landed on the shores of Crete. Seasoned soldiers, clad in armor and bearing the arms of Byzantium, disembarked, ready to join the Cretan rebels in their fight for liberation. The Venetian fleet, caught off guard, was nowhere to be seen. Marco Zeno watched helplessly as the Byzantine ships poured men and supplies onto Cretan soil. His gamble had failed, and now Venice faced a full-blown war against both the rebellious Cretans and the resurgent Byzantines. He knew that the fate of Venetian Crete, and perhaps his own, hung precariously in the balance. The battle for Crete had begun. The clash of steel, the roar of cannons, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Alexios, alongside Sophia, watched as the forces of Byzantium and Crete fought to reclaim their island, knowing that the road to freedom would be paved with sacrifice and blood. The clash of steel echoed across the plains outside Candia. Byzantine banners, long absent from Cretan soil, now flew alongside the standards of the rebellion. Alexios watched, a calculating gleam in his eyes as his gamble unfolded. Marco Zeno paced the battlements, a caged lion. The Venetian garrison, though well-trained, was outnumbered. He knew the city could not withstand a prolonged siege. Desperate measures were needed, and quickly. Sophia, guided by knowledge passed down through generations, led a small band through secret tunnels beneath the fields outside Candia. Their mission: to outflank the Venetian forces and strike a blow where they least expected it. Marco's orders were clear: deny the rebels any sustenance. The scorched earth policy was brutal, but he hoped it would break their will to fight. Smoke billowed into the sky, a testament to Venetian ruthlessness. Alexios watched the fires consume the harvest. While the tactic might weaken the Venetian defense, it would also bring immense suffering to the Cretan people. He wondered if the price of freedom was becoming too high. Sophia's group emerged from the earth like avenging spirits. Their surprise attack caught the Venetian supply convoy completely off guard. Farm tools became weapons as they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. News of the ambush reached Marco quickly. He slammed his fist on the table, scattering maps and papers. The rebels were bolder than he had anticipated, and he had underestimated the Cretan resolve. The fighting at the bridge was brutal. Neither side was willing to yield. The fate of Candia, and perhaps all of Crete, hung in the balance. Alexios spotted a weakness in the Venetian defenses. A concentrated push at that point could break their line and open a path to the city gates. Amidst the carnage, Sophia worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded. She was a beacon of hope in a sea of despair, her courage inspiring those around her. As darkness fell, the battle raged on. The ground was littered with the dead and dying. The fate of Crete remained uncertain, hanging precariously in the balance between Venetian ambition and Cretan resistance. The rebellion had been crushed, but the victory tasted like ash. Marco surveyed the devastation, the cost of Venetian dominance etched in every broken stone and lifeless body. He knew this was not the end, merely a lull in the storm. Alexios sailed away, leaving behind a smoldering island and shattered dreams of Byzantine resurgence. The Venetians had prevailed, but he had planted seeds of dissent that would surely sprout again. His mission was not a failure, but a strategic retreat. Sophia mourned the fallen, the faces of friends and family blending into a sea of loss. The rebellion had failed, but the spirit of Crete remained unbroken. She vowed to keep their memory alive and to continue the fight for freedom, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The economic repercussions of the rebellion were devastating. Trade routes were disrupted, fields lay barren, and the coffers of Venice were emptying. Marco knew that reasserting control was not enough. He had to rebuild the island's economy to ensure long-term stability. Alexios presented his report to the emperor, painting a picture of Venetian weakness and Cretan resilience. He argued for continued support of the island, not through open rebellion, but through subtle manipulation and economic pressure. The Byzantine dream of reclaiming Crete was far from dead. In the shadows, Sophia and other Cretan patriots planned their next move. They knew that another open rebellion would be suicidal. Instead, they focused on preserving their culture, resisting Venetian assimilation, and waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Marco poured resources into strengthening Candia's defenses, determined to prevent another uprising. He implemented stricter laws, increased the Venetian garrison, and cracked down on any sign of dissent. He would not allow Crete to slip from Venice's grasp. From Constantinople, Alexios orchestrated a subtle campaign of economic sabotage. Byzantine merchants flooded Cretan markets, offering lower prices and undermining Venetian control of trade. He aimed to weaken Venice from within, slowly eroding their grip on the island. Sophia dedicated herself to preserving Cretan culture, teaching the younger generation the language, history, and traditions of their ancestors. She knew that cultural resistance was just as important as armed rebellion in the fight for their freedom. Marco received disturbing reports of Byzantine economic activity and growing Cretan cultural resistance. He realized that the threat to Venetian control was not merely military, but also economic and cultural. He prepared for a long and arduous struggle to maintain Venice's hold on Crete. The future of Crete remained shrouded in uncertainty. The Venetians clung to their power, the Byzantines plotted their return, and the Cretans yearned for freedom. Sophia stood on the precipice of a new era, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Marco knew that the peace was fragile, a mere illusion masking the simmering discontent. The storm was gathering, and he wondered if Venice could weather it. The fate of Crete, and perhaps the fate of his family, hung in the balance.